We have language, and we have all these characteristics of human consciousness. And in modern intelligence today, an important part of human consciousness is the mathematical intelligence that uses mathematical models, uses computers, uses algorithms, and so on. But when you look at the living intelligence that is characteristic of all life, you can see that the mathematical models and algorithms are peripheral to this living intelligence. What living intelligence is, essentially, is the ability of living organisms to be in the world, to move around in it, and to survive in it. And so in recent decades with AI, we have, in my view, overemphasized the mathematical achievements, which are tremendous, but we have overemphasized them, and we have neglected our living embodied intelligence.
Welcome to Entangled World, where we explore our interrelated existential, social, economic, ecological, and technological challenges, their underlying drivers, and how a more beautiful world might emerge. I'm your host, Najia Shaukat-Lepsin. I'm a daughter of Pakistani Muslim immigrants, a mom, and an intersystems thinker. Join me on a journey to discover what is uniquely and meaningfully ours to do at this pivotal moment in time in service to the sacredness of life. Quick note before we get started, if you haven't already listened to the first full episode of this podcast called What is the Metacrisis, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that first. It's really a foundational episode that provides a lot of the grounding that is important for all the episodes that follow. Today on the podcast, I had the distinct honor and pleasure of speaking with Fritjof Capra. I have studied Fritjof's work for many years, have many of his books on my bookshelf. His work, I think, was my gateway drug into the world of systems thinking and beginning to understand the metacrisis, even though he didn't use that particular term in his work. Fritjof is the lead teacher of the Capra course and Systems View Lab. He is a scientist, educator, and activist who has written and lectured extensively about the philosophical and social implications of modern science. He is a founding director of the Berkeley-based Center for Ecoliteracy and serves on the faculty of the Amana-Key Executive Education Program in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He is a Fellow of Schumacher College and also serves on the Council of Earth Charter International. And he is the author of several international bestsellers, including The Tao of Physics, The Turning Point, The Web of Life, and has co-authored the multidisciplinary textbook, The Systems View of Life. Fritjof is the rare person who has engaged in not only a tremendous amount of research, theory, and writing, but also actuation in the world through his activism and bringing ecology education into public schools. In this episode, Fritjof talks about 4 key principles that summarize the culmination of his life's work and what he calls the systems view of life. First, life organizes itself in networks of processes. Second, life is inherently regenerative down to the molecular level. Third, life is inherently creative. And fourth, life is inherently intelligent. We discuss how the mechanistic worldview, which originated from René Descartes, who viewed the mind, which he called the thinking thing, as separate from matter, which he called the extended thing, and which has been the dominant worldview, is now finally being upended by a network-based worldview. The network worldview acknowledges that all of life is interconnected, co-evolving, and complex, and therefore cannot be controlled. We explore how the mechanistic worldview is still espoused by many technologists leading AI development who view intelligence as solely residing in the brain, discounting the embodied, felt ways of knowing. Ultimately, we discuss the importance of putting life at the center of everything we do, of everything that is worth doing in this time of meta-crisis. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you do, please subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast app, or subscribe to the Entangled World Pod YouTube channel. Thank you so much, Fritjof, for being here today on the Entangled World podcast.
It's a real pleasure, and I love your title, The Entangled World. It's so much connected with the work I'm doing.
Yes. It took me quite some time to think of an appropriate title for the podcast. And I loved that word entangled because it really described, I think, the moment that we find ourselves in, which is that we are in a moment of many different entangled crises that are intersecting with each other. Well, as you may know, I typically start all of my podcast conversations with just getting to know the guest a little bit. And I know that, you are very well known. Many people likely know your story, but I still would love to just kind of start with hearing a little bit about you, your story, and how you've come to do the work that you do in the world.
So, as you know, I was trained as a physicist in Austria. I'm Austrian, went to the University of Vienna. And from my student days, I was very interested in the philosophy of modern physics, and especially in the conceptual revolution that happened in quantum theory in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. It was a revolution that forced a handful of physicists very dramatically to abandon the view of matter as being composed of hard and solid small particles to a view that sees the world, the material world at the subatomic level, as an inseparable network of relationships. And these relationships, furthermore, are intrinsically dynamic. There is a continual dance of energy. So this was a very different picture. These physicists struggled with it for a long time, and I was fascinated by these developments. Now, this was in the mid-1960s, and at the same time, I became interested in Eastern philosophy, in the spiritual traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, which was very much the trend of the time. I studied these philosophies, I practiced meditation, I experimented with psychedelics, and all of that led me to recognize very striking parallels between this worldview of quantum physics and modern physics in general and the Eastern spiritual traditions. And so in the 1970s, I explored these parallels systematically and then wrote my first book, The Tao of Physics, which was published in 1975.
Yes.
Now, the next
I've read your book a couple of times, actually, because I love it so much.
There'll be a new edition next year because it'll be the 50th anniversary of the Tao of the first publication.
Oh, amazing.
So the next part of the story is that this book was tremendously successful, going beyond my wildest dreams. And as a consequence, I got invited to give lectures and seminars to many professional groups, to many organizations, met all kinds of people from all walks of life. And during these lectures and seminars, I often heard from people that a change of worldview, a paradigm shift, similar to the one that happened in physics, was now happening also in other areas, in medicine, in psychology, in economics, in management. So I got interested in those other areas. I expanded my view, and at the same time, I slowly switched from becoming a research scientist to becoming a science writer, which I am now. I still do a lot of research, but mainly for writing, not for publishing technical papers. So in the 1970s, then in the late 1970s, I began to realize that the issues and problems I was becoming interested in medicine, healthcare, economics, management, and so on, ecology, the environment, they all had to do with life, with living organisms, with social systems, and with ecosystems. And physics has nothing to say about the nature of life. So I switched in the 1980s, in the mid-80s, I left physics, and I switched to the life sciences, where a new understanding of life was emerging. And so I spent the next several decades studying and synthesizing this new understanding of life. I wrote several books about that. The last one is called The Systems View of Life, which I wrote with a colleague, Pierluigi Luisi. And that is what I call my synthesis. I call it the systems view of life because it's very hard. There is a fundamental change of metaphors from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. And a network, as everybody knows, is a certain pattern of nodes and links, of nodes and relationships. And therefore, to understand networks, we need to be able to think in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns, in terms of context. And in science, that is known as systemic thinking or systems thinking. And so I call my synthesis the systems view of life. And that's what I've been working on in the last few decades. And I also teach an online course, which I've done now for 8 years and which is widely known as Capra course. And I have 3,000 alumni around the world. So I'm very active in promoting this new understanding of life and its consequences and implications. That's my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I recently took your Capra course, and I have several of your books on my bookshelf back here, including the systems view of life. And I would love, your work has just really spanned such an astonishing array of fields. And I would love if you might just begin to summarize for us, what you mean by the systems view of life for those who are unfamiliar with your work.
Well, Nadia, if you had asked me that question a year ago, I would have spent quite a bit of time to explain various technical concepts that are part of this synthesis. But today, I can do something very different because recently I have found a completely non-technical way of summarizing my synthesis. And I do so in terms of 4 principles of life that are principles of organization that can be observed at all levels of complexity, from the smallest bacteria through the wide range of plants, fungi, animals, to humans, and also in social systems and ecosystems. So these 4 principles of life are the following. The first is that life organizes itself in networks. And I've already mentioned that this shift from the machine to the network as fundamental metaphors is at the very heart of the systems view. Now, these networks are not networks of living networks, are not networks of structures, but networks of processes. Of course, structures are involved in the processes, but they are essentially networks of processes, chemical processes in biological networks, processes of communication in social networks, processes of feeding, of organisms eating one another in ecological networks, and so on. And what these processes have in common is that they are regenerative processes, processes of regeneration. And that's my second principle. Life is inherently regenerative at all levels. Now, of course, we know, we look outside in nature that nature regenerates life all the time. We think of the turn of the seasons, of new growth in every spring, that's regeneration. But what the systems view adds is that this regeneration happens at all levels of complexity, down to the molecular networks in cells. So regeneration is the very essence of the life process. When regeneration stops, life stops. If you want to be more philosophical, you could also say that regeneration is the purpose of life, or is the meaning of life. That's what life is all about, continually regenerating itself. So then I have two more principles, and the third one is life is inherently creative. Every living system has the potential of creating new structures, new forms of order, new processes, new behavior patterns, and so on. So as human beings, we are not creative just if we happen to be artists or designers or something like this. All of us are creative, simply because we are alive, because life itself is inherently creative. And finally, my fourth principle is that life is inherently intelligent. What this means is that the interactions of a living organism with its environment are cognitive interactions. They are directed by the system according to its nature and according to previous experience. So those are the four principles. Life organizes itself in networks, and these living networks are inherently regenerative, creative, and intelligent. And I want to emphasize that these are non-technical and evocative terms, but they are based on very sophisticated theories of the last 20 or 30 years. These statements would not be possible within a scientific context before the 1980s, let's say, before the development of complexity theory. And of course, as you know, in my course and in my books, I go into much more detail and, analyze the theories behind these principles.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when I think about these four principles, in many ways, they provide hints for how we may approach the crises that we are facing today. So
Right.
on this podcast, we talk a lot about the meta crisis, or the entangled set of global existential risks that we face today that have these sort of common underlying drivers or features. So it's kind of like the forces of the ocean that you cannot see that create the waves.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you say is that the crisis underlying all of our different crises, whether you're talking about climate change or biodiversity loss or, financial systems collapse, vast income inequality, you say that the crisis underlying all of our crises is a crisis of perception. And I would love for you to kind of share a little bit of what you mean by
Right.
that.
Okay, well, this has to do directly with this fundamental change of worldview, where the central metaphor is no longer to see the world as a machine, but to see it as a network, a living network. Now, the mechanistic worldview, the old mechanistic worldview that sees the world as a machine, is fragmented and linear. Whereas the world in which we live is interconnected and complex meaning non-linear. And of course, we know that a network is non-linear. It goes in all directions, and it is completely interconnected. And so what is happening, the way I see this crisis of perception, is that at the forefront of science we have this beautiful systemic vision with these principles of life and so on, but this has not penetrated into various fields of society. So in medicine, doctors still very often see the body as a machine, where illness means that a part of the machine is not working and has to be fixed, either chemically with drugs or physically with surgery. We see in management, companies are seeing metaphorically as machines that can be designed, that are owned by people outside the company, that can be fine-tuned, that people talk about re-engineering and so on. So the machine metaphor is still alive. There is big change happening, and systemic thinking is spreading, but in different ways, in different areas, and different disciplines. Let me just mention that in economics, the biggest problem is the linear thinking implied in this obsession with economic growth. Most of our economists and politicians promote the idea that quantitative economic growth can be unlimited, perpetual, which is ridiculous, which is absurd on a finite planet. So a lot of work needs to be done to change this perception of the world.
Yeah, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but there's also a group of technologists working on artificial intelligence that now believe that we need to expand beyond the planet and have access to the resources of the entire universe in order to fuel the lifestyle that we want here on Earth. And actually, why don't we get into that now? What would be your sort of response to
this? Is actually part of the mechanistic worldview. They are thinking mechanistically because part of this attitude is that whenever you see a problem, you solve it with some new technology. Technology is always seen as the solution of the problems. But our problems are not technological. I mean, they are also technological. As you said in the beginning, when we talked about the entangled world, the major problems of our time are all interconnected and interdependent. None of them can be understood in isolation. So when you talk about a problem of resources or of technologies, yes, it involves technology, but it involves also human nature, it involves human values, it involves economics and politics and so on. And so it's very strange to think that our problems can be solved, our crisis can be solved by going outside of the planet, when all it takes, for example, to solve the climate emergency is to phase out fossil fuels and plant millions of trees to draw down the excessive CO2 that is already in the atmosphere. This is easy. It's technologically, conceptually, this is very easy. It can be easily organized. The reason why we're not doing it is that it is hampered by certain human values. Basically, it comes down to corporate greed. Corporations like the fossil fuel corporations prefer short-term profit rather than a long-term viable planet. And so we have to work on values, on ethics, on if you wish, spirituality, a spiritual outlook on life. And none of these have to do with technologies, although technologies are involved at some stage. But there, the good news is that the systemic problems that we have, which means the interconnected, entangled problems, the systemic problems require corresponding systemic solutions. And over the last few decades, the civil society organizations around the world have created and tested hundreds of these systemic solutions. So in our book, The Systems View of Life, Pierluigi and I spent 60 pages reviewing the most important and most effective systemic solutions. So we have the solutions. What we need is political will and leadership. We don't need new technologies, although being creative and ingenious, we will always create new technologies, but the solutions are already there.
How do you think that we create those shifts politically? Because the people who are in positions of power are incentivized in ways that go against creating that shift. And, of course, in the past, there's been mass social movements that have often led to positive changes. But I worry that the world that we live in now is so radically different that I wonder if even a mass social movement, even if you could get the environmental movement to collaborate with the gender rights movement, to collaborate with the ecology movement, would that still be enough given how much power and influence and wealth has accumulated at the top in the hands of so few?
Yeah, I think it would be enough, but we need to tell the real story. If we continue with the pretense that is prevalent in politics now, with the misleading narratives, with the lies, with the hypocrisy, if all that continues, it will be very hard. So, there's this old saying, we need to speak truth to power. And in this context, the story is that we live in an economic system, and since the 1990s, we have created a global economic system in which money and wealth is systematically transferred from the poor to the rich. That is how the economy works. This is how big businesses work. And politics is intrinsically corrupt. There's an institutional corruption in politics, known in this country as campaign finance. That's an innocuous term, but it's really bribing politicians to make laws that benefit the corporate world, which then becomes more powerful, gives more money to politicians, benefits even more with tax cuts and various advantages. And so in order to mask that, there are now a number of populist politicians who say the reason, let me first backtrack a moment and say, because of this transfer of money from the poor to the rich, the poor do not make any progress and suffer. And they're sick and tired of not advancing economically and financially. And therefore, they look for scapegoats. There are these populist politicians like, Trump in this country, or in the UK, it was Boris Johnson, for instance, with Brexit, and there are many others who say that the reason why you're suffering is because there are too many immigrants who take your jobs. Or in Europe, in the UK with Brexit, they said that these administrators in Brussels make laws that don't benefit us, and that restrict our freedom to decide ourselves what to do. And so there are all kinds of pretend fake causes that are evoked rather than pointing out what is really happening. I should also say that there are people, of course, who point that out. And one of the main heroes in this field is Robert Reich, who is a professor of public policy here at Berkeley and was the labor secretary in the Clinton administration. And Robert Reich ceaselessly in videos and in books tells this story of the money transfer from the poor to the rich and how poor, suffering people are seduced into voting for populists. For instance, the Donald Trump tells them in his rallies continually, "I'm fighting for you." He's not fighting for them at all. He's interested in his own wealth and nothing else. And so Robert Reich points that out ceaselessly. So I recommend his videos and his books very much.
Yeah, he's a fantastic communicator. He's really good at breaking down complex topics and explaining them. So we were talking about technology, and if we look at the history of technological innovations, we've always created a new technology in order to solve an existing problem. But in the creation of that technology, the innovation has often led to unintended consequences. It's had externalities in other places.
Right.
And
that
so-
is the essence of systemic problems, because the problems are interconnected. And so the technologies have environmental consequences, they have psychological consequences, they have energy consequences, and so on.
Yeah. And so now we are at a point where we are developing possibly could be the last real technology that humans develop, which is artificial intelligence. And we can't predict what will happen once technology becomes smarter than humans. However, there's many ways to look at intelligence, of course, and we should talk about that. But I'm curious to hear a bit about your perspective on sort of the ways in which we're thinking about intelligence and how to develop it artificially, and what is sort of missing from artificial intelligence that is unique to humans.
Okay, well, as you can imagine, I have thought quite a bit about this recently and have been involved in various discussions. And the way I see it is that intelligence is one of my 4 principles of life, that life is inherently intelligent. What this means, as I mentioned already, is that the interactions of a living organism with its environment are cognitive interactions. Another way of seeing this is to notice that all living organisms interact with their environment via sensory organs. They perceive things from the environment via sensory organs. And in evolution, as organisms become more and more complex, so do their sensory organs, and so do the corresponding cognitive processes. So cognition, the process of knowing, is characteristic of all life forms, and it becomes more and more complex as the biological structures become more and more complex. And so at a certain level, with vertebrates and mammals, we have nervous systems, we have brains, and then we have conceptual thought in the human mind with human consciousness. We have language, and we have all these characteristics of human consciousness. And in modern intelligence today, an important part of human consciousness is the mathematical intelligence that uses mathematical models, uses computers, uses algorithms, and so on. But when you look at the living intelligence that is characteristic of all life, you can see that the mathematical models and algorithms are peripheral to this living intelligence. What living intelligence is, essentially, is the ability of living organisms to be in the world, to move around in it, and to survive in it. And so in recent decades with AI, we have, in my view, overemphasized the mathematical achievements, which are tremendous, but we have overemphasized them and we have neglected our living embodied intelligence. And to see that, it is enough to realize, to remind ourselves that we have a civilization that considers making money as more important than human well-being. And when there is a choice, an economic choice, that either leads to more money, making more money, or to greater human well-being, the choice is always making more money at the expense of human well-being. And even with artificial intelligence, when you ask, why do people use a particular technology? The answer is most of the time to make more money. And so in this civilization that sees making money as the primary goal, we do so very often by destroying the natural environment on which the very survival of humanity depends. Now, you could say that it's not very smart to do that. So this human intelligence, including the various achievements of AI, are not very wise. They don't show us how to live in a wise way. So for me, the critical question is, when there is an example of a new technology in artificial intelligence, is to see whether it is appropriate or whether it is inappropriate, because although it increases our mathematical intelligence, it diminishes our living intelligence or wisdom of how we should live in the world. That's the critical question for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this question I've been thinking about a lot, which is, how do we actually create more wise humans? How do we go about that monumental task? Because I think right now we are developing artificial intelligence, essentially amplifying the current values that exist among humanity. And our current value system is destroying life. And so artificial intelligence will only amplify those values. So how do we, in the face of all the crises we face, become more wise humans?
Yeah, I think what we need to do very urgently is to put life at the very center of our activities, of our professional activities and personal activities, of our education, of our business structures, and so on. In other words, in terms of technology, it means to learn from the wisdom of nature. Nature has evolved the most sophisticated technologies, like photosynthesis, for instance, which we still don't know how to do, how to copy. And we can learn from this wisdom of nature, which is billions of years old, and live accordingly, develop ecological design, develop so-called biomimicry, mimicking the structures in nature. Now, all of this is being done. So we are on the way, but this is where we need to put our emphasis.
In your book, The Systems View of Life, you talk about how organizations have sort of these formal and informal structures, and the formal structures might include departments, reporting structures. Informal structures might include things like
Right.
culture and norms. And one of the things I've also been thinking about is, as we are making this shift from a mechanistic worldview towards a more network oriented, interconnected, entangled worldview, how do we create organization that really mimic that? So I'm curious, if you were starting an organization today and thinking about creating an organization based on the systems view of life, what might be some of the first principles you'd outline as sort of the basis for the formal structures?
Well, here I have another piece of good news. And this is, we don't need to start from scratch, because the systems view of life has been around for several decades now. And there are many organizations that have made that change and that we can use as models. Those, again, let's talk about the very core of the systems view of life, the shift from the mechanistic view, seeing the world, or in this case, an organization as a machine, to seeing it as a network. So in terms of structures, it would be a shift from hierarchies to networks. The formal structures today are largely hierarchical structures. And what these new organizations have done is to, as they put it, to flatten the hierarchies. So to have teams that cooperate, that can decide themselves what the best strategy would be, and so on. And the other part is to acknowledge the informal structures, the informal networks that exist in every organization. Since life organizes itself in networks, my first principle, this is also true in organizations. You have people who make friendships, alliances, help each other, cooperate very informally. They're not told or asked to do so. They do so naturally because they are alive. And so this is where the creativity of an organization lies, where the flexibility, the adaptability lies in its informal networks. So a smart leader would build an organization that has flatter hierarchies and acknowledges and legitimizes the informal networks that exist in every organization. And I can recommend an excellent book that goes into details about that. It's by Marjorie Kelly, a business journalist who traveled around the world to study these new organizations. And her book is called Owning Our Future. And she profiles, organizations of all sizes that have made these changes.
One of the questions I've had as I've thought about this sort of shift in organizations from hierarchies to more kind of empowered teams, network teams, things like holacracy and sociocracy have been around for a while.
Right.
The thing that I'm curious about is, what if you are in a situation where there really is an asymmetry of knowledge that a particular individual holds in comparison to the rest of the team? So where they are, they have asymmetric capacities in particular areas. How do you sort of think about reconciling a leader or an individual like that, who perhaps could direct an organization in a certain way, alongside the sort of like network where all teams are all empowered to set their own kind of direction and to collaborate?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I think it concerns the very nature of leadership. And you can say that there are two kinds of leadership. There's the traditional leadership of the individual you just described, with knowledge that gives him or her a lot of power, and with also ability to communicate clearly, a charismatic personality, great vision, and so on. And then there's the new type of leader, where leadership consists in facilitating the emergence of novelty, facilitating the collective creativity. So this leader would use her superior knowledge to empower others by creating conditions that maximize the collective creativity. And so it's a question, and both types of leadership are needed. It's a question of how to balance the two. And how to do it concretely is not something I can tell you, because I have no experience in leading people in an organization. I work as a writer and a theorist, but I know that many people do that.
Let's talk a little bit about evolutionary theory. So you've studied evolutionary theory. If we think of the biosphere with humans and all of their life forms within it as sort of a superorganism that is constantly co-evolving in relationship with everything that exists, where do you think we are in our stage of coevolution, and what does that mean for what's likely to unfold in the next 2 to 3 decades?
We started with the recognition that we are in a multifaceted crisis where all the major problems that we have, environment, climate, economic inequality, let's not forget most recently the tragic re-emergence of violence and war in various parts of the world, that all these problems are interconnected and interdependent. And when you analyze them from a systemic point of view, you will find that underlying these multiple problems of our meta crisis is this obsession with economic growth that fuels the various problems, and it is based basically on corporate greed, as I mentioned already. So it is a problem of values, a spiritual problem, and this is what we need to work on. And so growth, of course, is a characteristic of life. When you look at nature, everything grows, but everything doesn't grow all the time, and everything does not grow together. So in an ecosystem, for instance, you have certain organisms that grow rapidly in their youth, let's say, and then reach maturity, then decline, disintegrate, and liberate their components to become resources for new growth. So there's a multidimensional, multifaceted growth, and I'm calling this qualitative growth to distinguish it from the quantitative GDP growth that is promoted by most of our economists. So we need to shift from quantitative to qualitative growth, to growth that enhances the quality of life through continual regeneration. Could also call it regenerative growth. So this is the new kind of growth that we need to focus on. And to qualify growth also means to decide which things should grow, what is good growth, and which is bad growth. And from an ecological perspective, this distinction is very easy. Bad growth is growth that includes toxic materials, destroys communities, destroys the environment, is based on fossil fuels, and so on. And good growth is the opposite of that. That is growth that enhances local communities, that includes economic justice, it is based on renewable resources, and so on. So we need to make this shift from bad growth to good growth, from purely quantitative to qualitative growth. And again, it is being done. There are people and organizations promoting new economic indicators to replace the GDP and are more complex and more qualitative.
I recently listening to the audiobook version of Patterns of Connection, the collection of essays
Yeah.
that you wrote. And one of the things that you mentioned in one of the essays was having had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time with the renowned anthropologist, cyberneticist, writer Gregory Bateson. I came across Gregory Bateson's work actually through his daughter. So originally coming across Nora's work and then kind of going back to her father's work. She's obviously draws on her father's work quite a bit. And I'm curious to hear, what sort of his teachings impacted you the most, and what would you want to pass on to others from that time that you spent with him?
Well, at a personal level, let me start with that. I spent a lot of time with Gregory Bateson during the last 2 years of his life, 78 to 80, or 78 and 79 mostly. And this was at the Esalen Institute in California, on the California coast. And I gave lectures and seminars there, and so did he. And he had very strong impact on me, because this was the time when I realized, as I said in our conversation before, I realized that the problems and issues I was interested in all had to do with life, and physics cannot say anything about the nature of life. So I shifted my focus from physics to the life sciences during the 1980s. And Gregory Bateson triggered that. He was a very witty person and very, very strong communicator. He was very tall, very big, and also intellectually very, very big. I was first quite intimidated by him. And so he came to one of my seminars, and then somebody asked him what he thought about my work. And he said, "Capra, the man is crazy." He says, he thinks we are all electrons. And what he meant was, I was trying to use quantum physics as a model for living phenomena. And he pointed that out to me in this very extreme way, and that made me shift. Gregory Bateson was one of the leading systemic thinkers of the 20th century. His influence on patterns, on relationships, influenced me very much. And maybe most of all, his view of mind, or cognition as we call it today, as a process, not a thing. So let me spend a minute on that. In the 17th century, going back to the history of science, the scientific revolution, Descartes, the great French philosopher and scientist, divided the world into two separate and independent realms, that of mind and that of matter. And mind he called the thinking thing, and matter he called the extended thing. And so by calling mind a thing, he established this habit of thinking of the mind as some kind of intangible entity, and not being able to understand how this thinking thing interacted with the body or with matter in general. And the big change in the system's view of life has been to realize that mind is not a thing but a process. And Gregory Bateson was one of the first, together with Umberto Maturana, to make this realization in the late 60s, actually. So he called it mental process, and Maturana called it cognition, which is the term that is used today in cognitive science. That was a tremendous achievement of Gregory Bateson.
Yeah, and I see the reverberations of the mechanistic worldview still in existence in many of the technologists that are working on the race to AI, where you hear some of them talking about things like wanting to upload their consciousness to the cloud after they've passed on. This idea of even things like, wearing these things around their neck where they can sort of cut off their heads and preserve their heads and their brains and everything that's in it. And this idea runs so deep. The split between the mind and the body runs so deep. And I'm curious, like, how for people who are so invested in that worldview, in that perspective, that have built their entire careers around it, that are betting all of their financial wealth on it, how can
They're betting their bitcoins.
their bitcoins on it? Like, how does that worldview shift start to happen amongst those people? Because the reality is those people, the ones who will win the AI race, are the ones who are going to continue to amass more and more power and wealth. And so,
Well, Nadia, I have not really been interested in these extreme phenomena and have not studied them simply because, I'm doing so much already and I'm getting older and I can't do everything. But I have some good news for you. Recently, I went to a conference where I saw a fantastic documentary about this very subject. It's an hour or an hour and a half long, and it is called The Social Dilemma.
okay.
And it was produced by an organization called Center for Humane Technology.
Mhm.
So if you look that up, it's really impressive. It's scary. It's a scary documentary, but it's very impressive. And it really lays out the basic and analyzes it and shows how we can go beyond it.
Yeah. Yeah. And Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin, the founders of CHT, the Center for Humane Technology, they also actually recently did a couple of talks that are up on YouTube that I'll link to in the show notes, actually called The AI Dilemma. And the AI Dilemma talk is really, I think, an important one, because they really start to sort of draw some parallels between how social media kind of took everything by storm, and draw some parallels with the current moment that we're in with respect to artificial intelligence, and sort of looking at, like, what went wrong, what could we do
Yeah.
now to prevent the same sort of similar, different kind of issues from emerging. I know we've talked about artificial intelligence for a while. I actually, just in closing, I want to kind of bring us back down to earth a little bit, because I know you've done a lot of work with young people by bringing ecology principles and programs
Right.
into schools. And as you reflect on the current state of the world, for those listening that might be parents or educators, how might we raise and educate young people today to contribute towards shifting our current trajectory from one that's headed towards collapse to one that heads towards regeneration?
I think, as I said already, the key is to put life at the center of education, and to do it right from the start, from kindergarten, where it's very easy, because small children experience life directly, have relationships with their pets. They have stories where animals talk, where plants and trees talk. Uh, they experience nature directly. So, and teachers are very creative. If you give them the task, say, put life at the center of your teaching, they can do it. And these principles of life, I hope, will give them a language, because it is possible to express regeneration, creativity, and intelligence in a child's language. I have not done that and wouldn't know how to do it, or I would have to really work on it. But teachers know that, because they interact with children all the time and they're very creative. So I would say put life at the very center of the educational system.
Yeah, I would
And of
absolutely
course, that goes on then through elementary school and high school and college, universities, and professional training. And this is where I have contributed with my books and with my online course to teach the systems view of life to people, in all walks of life, all, professional disciplines.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for your work. I know it has impacted many, many people and will continue to have an impact for many, many years to come. So, just to close, my last question for you, Fritjof, would be who would you like to platform on this podcast?
Well, I have mentioned a few people already. So I would say Marjorie Kelly, Robert Reich, and there's a friend of mine called David Corten, Korten, who is a former business consultant and is a critic of corporate power. His best known book is called When Corporations Rule the World.
Mm.
And he has written a very perceptive article called Ecological Civilization from Emergency to Emergence, where he gives a brief history of this obsession with quantitative growth and money making and how it can be overcome. So David Corten is one I would very strongly recommend. And if you want to get something from the forefront of science, which is very fascinating, and you probably know about it already, it's Merlin Sheldrake and his book about fungi, which, by the way, is called Entangled Life. So you would like that.
It was actually one of the inspirations for the naming of this podcast.
Yes, yeah. So you should invite him.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was really fun and a great pleasure and very inspiring. And I wish you all the best for your podcast.
Thank you so much, Fritjof.
If you liked the episode and want to hear more conversations where we explore how a more beautiful world might emerge, subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast app or the Entangled World Pod YouTube channel. If you loved it, support the project at patreon.com/Entangled World. Thank you for listening and for coming on this journey together.